Welcome back, everyone. You may notice the background just changes slightly from video to video. I'm basically just moving to different corners of my home office, depending on where the sun is and where the bright spots are, and where I think maybe the house might be a little bit quieter. So, anyway, I'm still basically in the same place. I just keep shifting postures a little bit and maybe moving from chair to chair. But we are continuing our march through colonial America now. If you watch the introductory music video, it doesn't really have anything directly to do with the French and Indian War, but has a little Iron Maiden in there. I think it's the first hard rock thing we've really played for this class. And there are images of Indian War in there, so kind of comically in there, really. But we are going to be looking at one really big event that really is the culmination of colonial America. There had been many wars between England and France or England and Spain, various North American empires at war in Europe and at war in the colonies. But the French and Indian War is the final conflict and really the ultimate conflict before we get to the American Revolution. And it has a lot to do with why the American Revolution is going to come about as well. So it plays a key part here in our understanding of turning points in American history. I've stolen this subtitle, The War That Made America, from a PBS series from several years ago, a good video series really about this conflict. But we're going to try to give you in just 45 to 50 minutes a summary of this war. You do need to know what groups are involved in this war and what do each of them um, represent, what do they have to lose or to gain by this war. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about some of the specifics of the war, not a battle by battle approach, but we'll look at certain main key battles and how how the war turns. Finally, most importantly, we'll be looking at the results. What comes about as a result of the French and Indian War? It's quite interesting results and ironic in some places for what it's going to do, the impact of the various groups that were involved. So let's get underway. First of all, let's talk about the characteristics and motives of the various warring parties. Well, the name French and Indian War is a little misleading because it may make you think, well, this is a time the French are fighting some Indians. Well, it's the French and their Indian allies fighting against the English and their Indian allies. This is a conflict that took place in North America, started in North America, but there's also going to be a European component of this war. It was called the 7 Years' War there. So this truly is a world war. It is a global war that's taking place not just between England and France, but between their colonies as well, and involves some of their Indian allies. So we do need to know something about France and England and various Indian tribes involved here to understand the conflict. First of all, France. We've talked very briefly, you've read a little bit more about French colonial North America. The map here shows you basically where the French had controlled places like Quebec and Montreal, places along the St. Lawrence River, runs this way and empties out into the Atlantic, and the Great Lakes area along the Mississippi River Valley. France didn't have 13 separate colonies like the English. There's really just New France. They were much more united under the leadership of an appointed governor there. But there weren't nearly as many French as there were English. They are vastly outnumbered by the English in this area. But they did claim all tributaries to the Mississippi River. So that would even include the Ohio River running here. The French are going to claim this river as well. And that means they're going to be confronting some of the English colonies' possessions. Both Pennsylvania and Virginia claim some of this same land. So the French colonial claims are going to clash with English colonial claims. And they're going to be moving to try to establish forts in those river valleys to secure their claims. Now, we've mentioned that the French had a good alliance with some Indians, that they especially got along with the Huron Indians or other Algonquin-speaking Indians in Canada and in the Great Lakes area. The French were much more likely to intermarry with Indian tribes. Remember, they initially just came to establish trading posts, so good relations, good trading relations with Indians were necessary for the survival of their colony. They've not been, like the English, as hungry to gobble up more and more land, because the English are surviving on land ownership. The French had a much more modest number of people trying to make a living from trade with the Indians. Well, one group of Indians will have a reason to fight in this conflict because they've always opposed the French, and that's the Iroquois. The Iroquois were really not just one tribe, but 5, later 6 tribes, 6 Indian nations, all come together to form the Iroquois Confederation, mostly in upstate New York. You can see some of these names um, in the map here. It's a little bit blurry here, but groups like the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Seneca, various groups make up the Iroquois. And they had always opposed the French. I mean, from the very beginning of French presence in North America, this is the tribe that they used guns against, and they supported the enemies of the Iroquois. And so traditionally, from early 1600s through that century into the 1700s, they had been fighting the Iroquois because they were allied with enemies of the Iroquois, like the Huron. And they're all engaged in the fur trade, where they are competitors there. Well, the Iroquois were traditionally allies with the Dutch when New York was New Netherlands. But now that the English controlled that land, the Iroquois had adopted the English as an ally, but they were not real satisfied with the English as allies. The English, they felt, had been less reliable than the Dutch. So through some earlier conflicts, they ended up being dissatisfied with being fighting on the same side as the English. So as this conflict approached, the Iroquois were in a really good position to just be in the middle. Both the French and the English fear the Iroquois. The Iroquois are a very strong nation because it is a combination of several strong tribes together. They used to fight one another, but they've decided to form this confederation, really centralizing more of their warring power. And now, if there's conflict between two of those tribes, if a Mohawk warrior got into a conflict and killed a Seneca warrior, it's not going to be all out war between those tribes. There'll be some gift exchanges and forgiveness extended. But if anyone else messes with one of these Iroquois nations, they will pay for it. So the Iroquois have become a very powerful confederation, and the French and English know it. The French do not want to have to fight the Iroquois if they can avoid it. And the English definitely want the Iroquois on their side. So the Iroquois have the nice position of being able to play in the middle, see who will give them more gifts, see who will compel them to join one side or the other. The English almost always supported Iroquois claims. If the Iroquois said, this is our land, and we also extend land in this area as well, into Pennsylvania. Well, the English were inclined to accept their word on that, to believe them, and to say other tribes must pay homage back to the Iroquois. Well, Not all tribes appreciated that favoritism that the English show to the Iroquois. So this other tribe, this is not a single tribe. I'm really just describing um, Indians along the Ohio River Valley. Other tribes that are still big and still powerful, just perhaps not as numerous, not as powerful as the Iroquois alone. But groups like the Shawnee and the Delaware tribes, these are tribes that were along the Ohio River Valley, and they resent this closeness of the Iroquois and the English. They resent that the English are always going to side with the Iroquois because they know that's the main tribe they need to keep happy. So there are plenty of other tribes haven't previously been involved in conflict between England and France, but they're going to have a motive to support the French because they resent the English. They resent the connection between the English and the Iroquois, who basically look at these smaller tribes as groups that must still pay homage to the Iroquois, a long way away in some cases. So there's not just one group of Indians fighting in this conflict. There's many, many tribes, and some would like to just stay completely out of the conflict. That gets increasingly difficult. Groups are having to decide, do you think your fate is better staying with the French or joining the English? What path will you take? Well, then, of course, there's the English, and we've talked about them the most. We know there's 13 separate colonies. There's over 1 million English colonists now, if we add up all those colonies, far more than the French have. But they are divided, and they are spread out quite a bit. Notice my map here showing some of the major campaigns and battles of the French and Indian War. It's not going to include places like Georgia and South Carolina. Um, those places were far distant and really felt like they had nothing to do with this conflict. So there are parts of the English colonies who think this is someone else's problem. It has nothing to do with them. So the 1 million inhabitants of the English colonists really is reduced quite a bit. Plus, if we consider one of the main battlegrounds of this conflict is in Pennsylvania, well, let's think of who has populated Pennsylvania. It's got people from all over Europe, but especially the leadership are Quakers. Quakers are pacifists, and they have prided themselves on having a very different kind of relationship with Native Americans. They don't want war with Native Americans. And in many cases, the leadership in Philadelphia is not going to want to arm people in Western Pennsylvania who might be experiencing conflict with Native Americans. So the English may have a great numerical advantage here, but they are very divided. People far distant are indifferent to this conflict, and there's even large portions of the population of important colonies like Pennsylvania that want nothing to do with Indian conflict or conflict of any kind. So, interesting characteristics of the groups before we start them fighting. But now, let's get them at war, shall we? You'll probably know the person at the center of starting this conflict. His name was George Washington. I figured you'd heard of him. Washington was still a very young man, really about your age in some of your cases, I'm sure. He's 21, 22 years old when this conflict begins, and he happened to be at the center of it. He is from Virginia, the largest, the wealthiest, most populated colony of the 13 colonies. And he was selected by Virginia's appointed governor. It's a royal colony now, so king appoints a governor, and that governor had said George Washington's going to lead an expedition to go and make sure that English claims are secure in the Ohio River Valley. They've been hearing rumors that the French have started to build forts in the Ohio River Valley. The English are wanting to make sure that the French understand this is English land, not French. Of course, this is some land that both Virginians and Pennsylvanians think is theirs. but Washington is there to represent Virginia. So he takes a militia into the Ohio River Valley. He actually teams up with another Native American group. Um, there's a group led by a man that the English just called the Half King. Now, the reason they call him Half King is he's not really a king on his own. He doesn't really command a large force and completely independent. He owes his homage, he owes his position to the Iroquois. And he's not Iroquois himself, but the Iroquois have empowered him, given him some responsibility to make sure that the French are not encroaching on their land. So he's a half king. He also wants to make sure the French are not overstepping their bounds. So George Washington goes along with the half king and their men. They go um, to see for themselves if the French have really come into land they believe is English colony. Well, they find out, sure enough, the French are building a fort, and um, and a fight starts here. Small number of men, but several Frenchmen are wounded as Washington's men, the Half King's men, open fire on the French. Washington feels like he's done a good job. There's no one been killed, but several wounded, and felt like he could tell the French that they are not supposed to be in that land. But the Half King approaches one of the wounded commander there among the French, and he takes out his tomahawk. He says something to him in French, which translated meant, "You're not dead yet, my father." And then he takes out his tomahawk and splits the man's skull open. He reaches in, pulls out brain tissue. Hope you've already eaten. This gets kind of gross. And he just, washes his hands in the man's brains. Washington and the other Englishmen and the Virginians in this militia, they are horrified by what they have seen. They weren't anticipating this kind of brutal war at all. And especially, they're not expecting to keep fighting disarmed, injured Frenchmen. But the Half King's men do just that. And Washington finally tries to get them to stop. But you see, the Half King has a different agenda than Washington. He's been embarrassed, because the French are there. He is embarrassed. He seems to have lost his standing among the Iroquois, and he's very resentful that the French have come and imposed their power, and it makes him look bad. So he definitely wanted to kill some Frenchmen when he went on this expedition. And having done what he came to do, he and his men disappear. They leave. Washington, though, knows there are going to be some other Frenchmen come to join this group. I mean, when the shooting started, there's some ran away, and there's going to be more Frenchmen come to join. And Washington knows he's going to be in trouble now. He tries a pretty quick retreat. There's not really a safe place to hide. This fort was never completed, so he's just kind of running, looking for some place that he could safely fortify his men. But they're eventually overtaken by a larger French force, and Washington is captured. Now, the French could have killed him. They could have had someone, split his skull open too. But fortunately for Washington, that didn't happen. Instead, the French put a piece of paper in front of him and force him to sign something he doesn't really understand. He doesn't read or speak French, but he does know that they're saying, sign this or else. This document in French said, "You have started the conflict. You English. You came and brutally killed some of our men in this area, and the French are only acting in retaliation." So, in a way, Washington signed something that said he's responsible for what follows. Well, of course, it was a little more complicated than that. It was not just a 22-year-old Virginian that starts this whole conflict, but he is there at the beginning of the conflict. Now, they will eventually let him go, but the French make it clear they have no intention of leaving this area. The Ohio River Valley is theirs, and everything that runs into it and into the Mississippi River. So there's war now by mid 1750s. It's called the 7 Years' War in Europe, but it actually lasts quite a bit longer. It lasts more like 9 years if you look at the North American phase of this war. So this is started 1754. Well, another prominent American gets involved early here. We've already mentioned Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin is instrumental in pushing this plan called the Albany Plan of Union. And this flag is um, his design for trying to unite the colonies. You can see a lot of colonies represented: New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland. Virginia even gets a loop in the tail. They're so big. North Carolina, South Carolina. Georgia's still so new. Maybe it's just barely a rattle here. But Benjamin Franklin was in a meeting in Albany, New York. It's a meeting of various English colonies as well as Iroquois um, representatives, Indian representatives. And Franklin wants to make sure that the colonies unite together to fight the French. No, he knows that all of these colonies are separate and autonomous. They don't have governing links between them. But he thought each of them needs to give up some of their own resources, some of their own autonomy in order to unite and fight together. Well, that was just his idea. It's not what's going to be accepted at the Albany meeting. His Albany Plan of Union goes nowhere because essentially all of these colonies think of themselves very separately. They're not one united group. Um, People in Pennsylvania are very separated from those in New York, and the New Yorkers don't identify with people in the various New England colonies. So Franklin's plan is not going to be accepted, and he thinks it's a terrible consequence that it's not. Um, Other things lead to some trouble for the English when they finally have the professional soldiers come, not just militia like George Washington, but real English professional soldiers. Edward Braddock was a general who comes into Pennsylvania and ready to lead an expedition against the French. He's basically going to go back to where Washington had first confronted the French, where they're building forts, and root the French out. But Braddock is a professional English soldier, and he really had little regard for the English colonists. You know, he didn't think of those colonists as really his equal. Certainly, just because you're part of a militia does not make you equal to the professional English soldiers. And he had much less regard for Native Americans. You know, he didn't really want to hear anything about different fighting tactics, you know, the ways that Indians are going to fight in the wilderness being very different from European style fighting. That didn't interest him. So Braddock um, Braddock comes and starts organizing the army, which is going to include some militia as well. And Washington really admired him. I mean, this is the kind of man Washington hoped he would be someday. You know, a general in the British Army, a man who can really organize, is brave, and fights in the name of England. Washington admired him, but he's going to have mostly just a memory of him after this, because Braddock's not going to last through this campaign. Marching across Pennsylvania, all the warnings that Braddock had heard about Indians' style of fighting happened to him, and he was not prepared. Indians and their French allies were hiding in the trees on either side of the open field, and they start firing at the English. They're basically just kind of caught in a crossfire here. They could line up their men in one way and be shooting at the French and Indians in one direction, and then realize they're being shot from behind too. So how do we get people pointing the other direction and fighting? It was terrible, terrible for Braddock personally. He's killed, and terrible for the English as well, because they lose a huge portion of these 2,500 men that were supposed to march across Pennsylvania and secure English claims. Washington survives this battle. He's there again as an assistant to Braddock. But it's not that he was completely out of danger. Washington had several bullet holes in his coat. He'd never been hit, but he obviously had several really close calls. So Braddock just becomes a memory to him now, a man he still admired, but who might have done better if he had listened to some advice from other colonials and not just brushed them off. Well, with the English loss here of a general, a loss of a major battle here, um, this encouraged Indian rebellions all over, up and down the English colonies. Um, Now, even places as distant as the Carolinas become war zones in the West because other Indian tribes hear about this. They know the English are preoccupied, they are vulnerable, and so there's all kinds of war along the back country, the frontiers of the English colonies. So it's a bad time for English colonies after Braddock's loss and war in the back country. Well, if we speed the narrative along a little bit, the English are going to turn things around. And one of the main people that's going to turn things around is a new prime minister named William Pitt. Pitt was insistent that the English win this war. I mean, of course, all prime ministers would want to win a war between, the English would want to beat the French and everything, but he especially says, we cannot lose this part of the conflict in North America. We must win in North America. It's just crucial. So he was willing to spend more money than they had, to borrow money wherever they needed to make sure they prevailed against the French. And he's going to do some things to try to repair relations with the colonies. If Edward Braddock had kind of looked down his nose at the militia, Pitt is going to send generals now that will at least recognize the ranks that militia call themselves. George Washington had not earned the rank of colonel through a normal progression in the British Army. He had just been elected a colonel because he comes from a prominent family, and he's tall, he's a leader, so he gets this honorary title. Well, new generals are at least going to say, okay, we'll call him colonel. He won't really have the same standing as a colonel in the British Army, but we'll give him respect, and others as well. This is not just about Washington's hurt feelings, it's more just relations between the English army and the colonists that they're there to fight for. So Pitt does help turn things around by some new military policies and by borrowing lots of money to fight this war. And the English are going to have more success next time they march through Pennsylvania. They managed to go and capture the French fort, now completed, called Fort Duquesne. Now, I know to English speakers like myself, monolinguists, this looks like Fort Duquesne. If that helps you spell it, that's fine. But it's Fort Duquesne, and this time the English proceed a little differently. Instead of just stringing 2,500 men out across Pennsylvania and getting men way ahead of their supplies, this time the English go very methodically, just move to a location, build a fort, and then bring all the supplies to that fort. Go a few more miles, build another fort, and bring all the supplies into that fort. And they methodically go and build forts across western Pennsylvania until they've reached Fort Duquesne. And now they could bring all of their men, not strung out across Pennsylvania, but they bring all of their men, all their equipment to bear against this French Fort Duquesne. Well, this time the English are going to overwhelm the fort. They will take it over and give it a new name. In honor of the prime minister, this is going to be Fort Pitt, and we know it today better as Pittsburgh. This is western Pennsylvania, a future steel town for football fans, Pittsburgh Steelers. But that was Fort Pitt was originally Fort Duquesne, this French fort that's at the center of the French and Indian War. Now, the picture you see here is of another climactic battle near the end of the conflict. Things are turning around for the English in the late 1750s. And this is a scene from the Battle of Quebec. The English started to win battles, and now they're trying to take the war into Canada itself. And the war in Canada features the English general James Wolfe and the French general, the Marquis de Montcalm. There's a great old classic history book about Wolfe versus Montcalm, because it is depicted as this great climactic battle between two great European powers who have had great influence in North America, but which one's really going to be the future of North America? This book by Francis Parkman really portrays the French as the people characterized more by Catholicism and monarchy, hierarchy. Are they going to be the future of North America, or is it going to be the British, the English? And Francis Parkman describes them as being more people led by representative government, a limited monarchy, and Protestantism. Well, of course, Francis Parkman's kind of setting us up for seeing, North America is going to be more characterized by those English qualities, because the English end up winning this war. But the Battle of Quebec is one of the more climactic battles here because Montcalm had been very successful against the British, even though he did not like his Indian allies. Montcalm, all of his private writings, he does not appreciate Indian culture. He thinks of them as savages, seeing the way that they fight, their ceremonies. He really cannot stand his allies. Yet he had been very successful using them and the fear of them against the English. In previous conflicts, Montcalm had won every battle basically by getting the English to think, if you don't surrender, I will not be able to hold back these savages who are going to come and scalp you once we take over your fort. Montcalm had been very successful. But in this case, Montcalm was playing defense in Quebec, and James Wolfe is trying to find a way to get to Quebec. It sits up on a high plateau, and there's steep cliffs that drop into the St. Lawrence River. There's no way from the river to be able to blast Quebec, and from across the river, the artillery is just too far away to have much impact on Quebec. So Wolfe was trying to figure out a way to invade Quebec, but how is he going to get there with these sheer cliffs on either side of the river? Well, at night, he's going to have his men climb these cliffs so that by light of morning, he'll have an army right there on the plains ready to invade. And Montcalm comes out to meet him too when he is surprised and realizes English forces are there. So in this famous painting, we see James Wolfe dying on the ground. He's been mortally wounded in the battle. But these people surrounding him are also telling him, you've won. Your plan worked, and we've won the Battle of Quebec. Montcalm was also killed in this battle too. So perhaps that's one of the reasons these two military leaders are so idolized and romanticized here. They both die in this conflict. But what that meant was the English had gained control in Canada, and they're going to win more and more and really seize control and win the ultimate prize, the French and Indian War. Now, the war isn't officially over until a peace treaty is signed in 1763, but there weren't a lot of conflict still in North America in the last couple of years of this conflict. This is still just fighting in Europe and other places. Now, let me focus on the results. What happens because of this war? Well, for France, the war is devastating because they lose it all. The Treaty of Paris says that they are going to give or what says on the map here, it's ceded. They cede the land here, Quebec, and Canada, all this area around the Great Lakes, all this Mississippi River territory, everything east of the Mississippi, they've handed over to the British. It's a humiliating defeat for the French, and they're going to be very upset about it. You can rest assured that if there's a chance for them to get revenge in the next generation, they're going to want to do that. If there's a chance for them to help the English suffer in North America, they will be glad to lend a hand. Now, the results for various Indian tribes is a bit more complicated because there were so many different tribes. Those that were in the Ohio River Valley, groups like the Delaware, the Shawnee Indians, well, they sided with the French in this conflict. And because they had sided with the loser in the conflict, they too were going to suffer. But they never really felt like they had been defeated themselves. It's just the French that gave up the fight. So many of these groups continued to war against the English. One famous leader, Pontiac, continued to fight around the Great Lakes area, even pushing further east. Pontiac continued to fight against the English because he felt like they're just going to keep encroaching on Indian lands, and he didn't matter to him that the French had given up on the fight. He's going to continue his war against the English. He's pretty effective too, because the English will decide to discourage English colonists from crossing the Appalachian Mountains and going into this new land that the French have ceded to them. Pontiac's a pretty effective warrior. Now, his counterpart is Neolin. Oftentimes, when there's an Indian coalition built, there may be a warrior leader and a spiritual leader. Well, Neolin was the spiritual leader of this coalition, and Neolin he had convinced many Indians to reject European goods, reject their culture, and go back to a time where Indian culture was more pure. They didn't depend on European goods. So Neolin is saying, give up Christianity. Some Indians had been converted to Christianity, but to Neolin, that was something that was devastating to Indian culture. And alcohol. These European traders have introduced alcohol to Native Americans, and it's had a devastating effect. Now, guns is a different issue. Better weapons. The Indians were kind of reluctant to let those things go, but if the Indians get used to using guns, they must rely on some European power to supply them with more guns and with ammunition. The Indians don't have an industrial plant that makes musket balls. So Neolin was encouraging Indians to go back to a day that they did not rely on Europeans for anything. It was really a desperate attempt to say, let's rewind the clock to sometime before Columbus, before other explorers came and started to change. Because when Old and New World came together, they're both changed irrevocably. Well, as a result of Pontiac's rebellion, Pontiac's war, really continuation of this war, a lot of colonists really grew to hate not just Pontiac's coalition, but any Indian. And sometimes they took out their fury against just anyone. There was a small group of Indians in Pennsylvania named the Conestoga Indians, and they were not really a threat to Pennsylvania. There's just about 20 of them still alive, but because they were Indian and because this Pontiac rebellion was going on, there was a group of men from around the town or the county of Paxton. They're called the Paxton Boys. And these Paxton Boys thought Pennsylvania has not done its job to rid us of any kind of Indian threat. There's too many Quakers really that run this colony and won't do their job in securing people in the West, Western Pennsylvania. So Paxton Boys took it upon themselves to go and attack these Conestoga Indians. Well, there's 20 people, men, women, and children. They're not a great warrior tribe. In fact, the Conestoga had been converted to Christianity. They really posed no threat to Pennsylvania. But as far as the Paxton Boys are concerned, any Indian group is a threat. Pontiac is a great threat, and any Indian group could join him. So they wipe out this Conestoga group. Now, not everyone in Pennsylvania is approving of this. Benjamin Franklin was very critical of the Paxton Boys. He thought, they were the savages. They're the ones that have done wrong. But there was a lot of resentment of Quaker leadership. And by the way, this is a crisis for Quakers, this war. And a lot of Quakers, when they're faced with this dilemma of do we arm ourselves and get ready to defend in the name of England, or do we step out of leadership because leadership might require war? Many Quakers decide to take the latter course. Step out of leadership, stick with your religious principles, but step out of political leadership. Many Quakers take that path. So great colonial hatred toward all Indians grows after this conflict, even when it's not targeted against the actual groups that may be a threat. Now, the Iroquois, well, they chose the right side. They ended up siding with the English, and they were very useful in the fight against the French. So you might expect things are going to get better for them, but actually it doesn't, because the Iroquois once had the privileged position of playing both sides, kind of being in the middle and being courted by both the French and the English. Who's going to give them more gifts? Who's going to curry their favor the most? That's not an option once the French are removed. When the French are no longer in possession, no longer govern any land, the Iroquois don't have someone else to balance against the English anymore. It's just the Iroquois and the English. Now, sometimes they may feel more comfortable with the English leadership actually back in England than they are the colonists right there looking to move deeper and deeper into the West. But the Iroquois are not in a better position afterward than they were before this conflict, because there's no longer a chance to play England versus France. It's ironic. They pick the right side and they win. Things are still going to get worse for them. Finally, for England, well, this is a glorious moment to be British. 1763, the English had just absorbed a whole bunch more land. They're no longer just this strip of 13 colonies here. They also have Canada, the Great Lakes area, everything on this side of the Mississippi. This map actually is still calling this New France, but really this side of the Mississippi is handed over to Spain. So this becomes Spanish territory. But the British have every reason to feel great confidence. They've just grown in their possession of lands after the French and Indian War. However, this has been a very costly war. This has been an expensive war, and it's going to be a war that means they're going to have to start getting more taxes from these colonists. And Parliament's going to get involved in ways that they've never been involved before. They've never directly taxed the colonists, but they're going to start. They've let colonists kind of govern themselves in these 13 colonies. Parliament's going to start getting more involved. All this land that's been acquired from the war, now colonists are excited to be able to move into this land. Now Parliament's going to say you can't move beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So here's a great irony of the French and Indian War. Although it is a victory for England, it is going to kickstart a lot of conflict between the colonists and the mother country. And 20 years later, when there's a Treaty of Paris 1783, it's going to be the treaty that ends the American Revolution. That's where we're going next. Hope you enjoyed this, and keep paying attention and working hard. Thank you very much. Have a good one.